Welcome to the Cove Podcast, your stop for PME on the go.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Cove Podcast. I'm Captain Todd Lempa, your regular host. On today's episode, we're going to talk about command responsibility, specifically holding senior leaders responsible for the things that they're set out to achieve and encouraging real success in the Australian Army. It's going to be a complex sort of topic to sort of discuss and weave in, but we're going to attempt our best today. My guest is, again, you've come on a number of times, sir, but Major General Chris Smith, who is the Deputy Chief of Army. His last podcast was on warrior culture. We're talking about death symbology, warrior culture, and who we are as an army and a profession. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast again, sir.
Of course. Thanks, mate.
Okay, before we launch into the sort of command responsibility and the difficult task of defining what is sort of right and wrong or what you should be held to account for, let's talk about, it's obvious, I think, and there'll be a number of people in the Army talking about, have senior leaders been held to account and like when has it happened and all that sort of stuff. And they're going to look to probably examples of their commanding officers or commanding officers that they've seen being sacked for certain things. It's quite obvious, often black and white. But if we sort of zoom out a little bit, less so black and white at the senior leadership level, I think. Can you just talk, before we get into that meaty subject and trying to define command responsibility, can you just talk about the difference, I suppose, between the commanding officers and sub-unit commanders and senior leaders and generals? What is the difference there?
Yeah. I might just take one step back and just start with why am I talking about senior officer accountability right now, and when I say senior officer, I mean generals, and I think it's part of, it is part of the chief's reflection on the state of the profession, and he's looking at three particular parts: knowledge and expertise, whether we've got a clear sense of what our jurisdiction as professionals is, and then of course accountability. And rightly, he said, let's start by looking at whether we're holding our generals to account before we look at any other part of the organisation. So that's why I'm talking, I think. But you asked the question, though, what is the difference between generally holding commanders to account and generals?
Is there a difference, I suppose?
Yeah, I think there is.
Yeah.
And I think it for a general, and it doesn't matter if you're the chief of the army or a commander of forces command or the 1st Division or a deputy chief, generals have institutional responsibility, that decisions that generals make or don't make or their conduct affects the whole army, even though they might be only in charge of or have responsibility for a portion of it. So I think that's the big difference. You can hold a commanding officer of a battalion to account for the way they exercise their responsibility for the battalion, and that has certain features which we no need to discuss today. But the actions of a general affect the institution, and I think that's the big difference. Now we'll talk shortly, I imagine, about sort of the reflections of the chief and the generals on how we should exercise that accountability. But that's an important difference, and I'll probably, as we go through, try to give everybody a sense of, what does that actually mean?
When we first talked about this episode idea, and it's been in the works for a few months now, we're talking about defining what command responsibility is, and we'll do that in 2 seconds. And then you've done a body of work in terms of sort of really working through what that looks like, and then ultimately we talk about some risks. If we start with the definition, though, what are we talking about? You talked about the chief's 3 priorities, the third one being accountability, getting after sort of professionalising the workforce by holding it to account. What is commander responsibility in the sense that we're going to talk about today?
Again, I'm going to go back a step. So it's important we know that we've had now sort of 2 or 3 big sessions among the generals and some others that have supported us in this thinking around the table to sort of come to grips with what this is and to ask the question as to whether the Army is holding its senior officers to account adequately or accepting that responsibility. And sorry, I'm probably drifting off here, but I think it's important. We the first question to ask was, to what extent are we holding ourselves to account? And we reflected backwards. And I think we haven't been, I think it's quite clear that we probably haven't really been holding our senior leaders to account in the same way that I think other institutions do. And I suspect those listening or watching could point out that there are some public institutions, even senior officials in football codes, who have stood aside for important but probably not as institutionally significant as things that have happened in the army over the last 40 or 50 years, where we have no real record of senior leaders being sacked or standing aside. So I think on that reflection we asked the question, and it came from, I think in part, a reflection on Afghanistan war crimes, the Brereton inquiry, and a knowledge that there certainly was, but there is still some unease in the army and probably more broadly in the veteran community about the fact that out of Brereton it seems that a lot of NCOs and troops have had the attention put on them, but surely if that manifest when it did, surely that's a function of leadership, and it was of such an extent that it's a function of institutional leadership, which I was just talking about. Why have no senior officers been held to account? So it comes from that idea. So I think it's fair for me to report out of that we believe that maybe we haven't been holding senior officers to account. So that's where this stems from. Yep.
Is it unique to Australia? This is, you talked about 40 to 50 years, decades of time where we've sort of struggled with, and it's come to to the forefront now about you addressing it and the chief's officer addressing it and stuff. But is it unique to Australia, and sort of what sort of do other countries struggle with the same sort of thing?
Yeah, I think everybody does, and I imagine that this will always be a struggle. It's not an easy thing to do. I think the exemplar of this, at least from my knowledge, is Thomas Rick's books, the Generals, and he reflects on under George Marshall's leadership of the US Army in the Second World War, that tendency to remove quite a lot of generals from command, but in many cases to restore them to command, that there was a strong emphasis on that. And I think in his book, he sort of his narrative is that sort of disappeared out of the US Army, and particularly during the Vietnam era, and that there wasn't the same, and that potentially that was a factor in the performance of the Army over that time. And I think he even makes the point that tends to continue today. But the truth is the US Army and the US Marine Corps have a much clearer record of holding senior leaders to account and removing them from command and their resignation around matters than what we have. Ours is nearly non-existent. And I suspect there are others. I have no master of our own history necessarily. The only ones that really come to mind that I'm aware of was the sacking of General Rao, the First Corps commander, General Tubby Allen, the 7th Division commander, and Potts, the Maroubra Force commander, around the Kokoda track and all that went there. But to be frank, even a couple of those were more actually about personality clashes than they were actually about even though in the background was a little bit of pressure from Curtin and so on about the performance. But so I think that others probably do it. We investigated one case study to try and explore. Our second meeting, which was the one at ADFA, we had a couple of case studies, and we treated it like a war game to say, well, if we're in this situation, what would we do now? As if to say, what would be our habit? And then to ask, but what ought we do if we're going to improve senior officer accountability? Yeah. One of the case studies we looked at was Camp Bastion in Afghanistan in 2012.
Camp Bastion was a British-led military base in the Helmand province in Afghanistan. What happened was there was a UK out of court and sort of providing security for this base or the camp, and they had made a number of requests for more security forces to be able to defend this position. But what actually happened was that the UK started to draw down on the protection on the outside of the base, which led to, on the evening of 14th of September, 15 Taliban insurgents breached Camp Bastion's eastern perimeter, where the UK had security responsibilities. They killed two US Marines, wounded a number of both serving military members, but also contractors, and then destroyed 6 US Harrier fighter jets. So a combination of like US and UK, who's supposed to provide security, who wasn't. UK was obviously on that sort of those guard towers that were otherwise left vacant because they had moved and thinned out, I suppose, on that security perimeter. Difficult case study, 2 different nations, 2 different approaches. You just talked about the US Marines taking a different approach over history. How did it go? How did it go out? Play out?
So the Marine generals were removed from command, and I think even forced out of the Corps. I understand that the British general officer wasn't sacked, and in fact went on and got promoted. We used that case study to highlight this quite distinct difference. And we asked ourselves openly, if that was us, let's say we were in the British position, what do we think we would have done at the time? And we around the table agreed that we probably would have done the same thing as what the British did in that circumstance, not what the Marines did. And we asked ourselves whether that's right. I think, without going into that any further, I think it was around that discussion that we'd wrestled, if I can just sort of deviate a bit, we'd wrestled over several days, a couple of meetings and days of this and looking at case studies.
Yeah, you said you had 7 case studies lined up and you only got to 2.
Yeah, well, exactly. Is one example.
The complexity of how difficult it is to define what you would have done and then what the ideal.
That's right. Yeah. Look, from our first meeting last year, we sort of, the big conclusion we came to was this idea that in order to hold somebody to account, there needs to be an assessment of what could they have done, or could they have acted to either mitigate or prevent or intervene to resolve what had happened, and should they have? And depending on the answer to those is the extent to which you hold somebody to account for what happened. And we thought that would be sort of the big idea that would lead us to a conclusion about how we deal with senior officers when, the premise of this is that something has happened that ought not have. It's had some consequences. So what do you do in response? And you ask those questions. It proved not to be that helpful because, to one extent, of course, we all have this sense that command in the military implies vicarious responsibility. You're responsible for everything good and bad that happens in your organisation. That's the nature of command. So should and could have is almost implied. Whether you've been there in command for 1 minute and the thing went wrong, or you've been there for 4 years, that's the nature of it. And that's by the way, the idea of strict liability. But we realised though that for on this sort of the second meeting at ADFA, that in fact it's different for generals and for this institutional idea. And it was around the discussion of that particular case study that we sort of worked out that really this is about, if it's the institution, it's about trust and confidence. That's actually what matters. That it's trust and confidence of the troops that you're responsible for. At the very senior levels, it's the trust and confidence of the government in your capacity to lead the institution, but there's also the trust and confidence of the public. So that really the action here is about restoration when trust and confidence is lost. And it's really important. And what we found was that and it goes to this point why it's important to treat command somewhat different to generalship and senior leadership, and that difference between institution and the unit you're in charge of. Because what we struggled with in some of our early discussions was this sense of fairness, and this might seem to those listening and watching typical of generals, but we struggled a little bit to separate out the idea of fairness. That, well, surely if something's gone wrong and along the lines of could have and should have, that if they couldn't have acted or there was no obligation should have, well, then it's unfair to hold them to account for what happened.
Or too far removed as well.
Or being too far removed, exactly. Or it might have been something that your predecessor was largely responsible for, so how could you have done anything about it? There's this sense of fairness. But when we realised that, hey, this is not about us, you, this is about the institution, and then we recognise that this is institution's largely about a function of loss of and regaining trust and confidence, then you take the personal out of it. Because our concern was that if we instituted a harder line like Marshall on standing aside or sacking senior officers for things that have happened right now, it would seem to be utterly personal, that you've done something and it would fall largely on a sense of the carelessness or negligence or incompetence of the individual, which is not necessarily true in all instances, at least. So, and I'm trying to think of an example. For example, I could imagine in some circumstances that something's happened in the institution, the army, that the consequences politically could be such that the government loses confidence. Now, it could be utterly cynical, but loses confidence in the army or in its leaders, even though it is utterly cynical or quite unfair in the circumstances on, say, the chief or the deputy or something. But if you recognise that, hey, it's not about you, it's a privilege for the job you're in, it's about the institution, to restore trust, the best thing to do is just to stand aside. Then we sort of came to the conclusion, yep, that's the point here. You've got to stand aside. It's not about you, it's not about fairness. We don't need to spend time. It might take a 2-year inquiry to work out the extent that you could or should have done something, because that's no good. If there's an immediate loss of confidence, then restoration needs to happen quickly. Then we can't afford all of that, in essence, necessarily due process and so on. And it sort of made us realise that really if the army's working well, the right senior leader will identify that the loss of trust and confidence is serious enough because of the consequence of the matter that they ought to stand aside and that they ought to do it voluntarily, rather than having an opposed. I mean, that would be the ultimate circumstance. So that's sort of where we got. But that trust and confidence idea sort of takes the personal away and makes that decision. I'm not suggesting that's easy. And of course, the proof will be in the pudding. Me talking today alone will put everybody on high alert and waiting for the next moment that something terrible happens, or there's a recklessness in decision making, or even a failure. We should talk shortly to say this is not a peacetime thing. This is particularly a battlefield thing. That failure in battle, and look, actually, and sorry, I'll finish that point. That the troops and everybody will say, well, here's the moment. Who's going to step up and be the person that acts to restore trust and confidence? But I think, and that quite rightly they will. So we need to hold ourselves to this. But I think the battlefield and wartime is probably a better example.
It's somewhat I think not easier is the wrong word, but it's somewhat more simplistic. If you
Yeah.
can't advance up
Yeah.
a track, for example,
Yes.
and I've asked you multiple times to do that,
Yeah.
regardless of if it's under your control, like or
Yep.
the circumstances are under your control, I'm
Yep.
going to mark and bypass you with another commander, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And
Yeah.
and it could be a range of factors that are involved for which you can't address. But maybe the consequence of that is a loss of trust and confidence. I mean, you can't move your brigade or your division or your corps forward. It's necessary to win the war. That change of leadership might be the necessary thing that breaks that. So trust and confidence again is a good criteria for this. I think a good example of this, it's not an Australian one, but of course is the American Second Corps when it first introduced into the war in North Africa. I'm trying to think of his first name. General Fredendall was the commander of the corps, defeated quite seriously at Kasserine. He's removed from command. Patton comes in to replace him, and I think in the space of a week, Patton does a whole bunch of things, sort of restores confidence back to the army, and then wins the next battle at Al-Ghatar, I think it is, sort of 7 or 8 days later. So these things do matter, and I think a lot of what George Marshall did in removing commanders in the Second World War went to that point. I think probably a better case study for what the US Army did is one closer to home was General Eichelberger, I think, was the commander of the First Corps. And he, I think under the instructions from MacArthur, in fact, I think MacArthur, this is the famous one where he said to him, hey, you need to go forward and relieve Harding at Buna. And for those who might remember, this is the first battle for the US Army in New Guinea. The 32nd Division was performing quite poorly and making no ground. So he sent Eichelberger forward as the corps commander, as Harding's boss, and said relieve Harding. Eichelberger had no intention to do so and expected to find that MacArthur, which was typical of him, had no sense of what the reality was on the ground. He's expecting too much. It's very difficult. Eichelberger went forward and then went forward to the very front line, discovering most of the troops not right at the front, goofing off, lost their confidence, no enthusiasm for the fight. Realised then that Harding himself had never actually visited, or never, or at least very rarely had visited the forward positions, and then removed him on the spot. And if I'm not mistaken, commanded the division, almost took personal command of the division himself. But it's another example where removing somebody from command to restore trust and confidence actually made the difference in battle.
Yeah, and that consequence as well at that point, it seems obvious, right? If
Yep.
we relieve you, it's not for you, it's for the broader organisation. And the
Exactly.
consequence is that we move up on the right flank instead of the left. We've got a fresh eyes over the front line to see what the discipline and motivation and morale of
Yep.
the troops are and stuff like that. It's obvious.
Yep.
Less obvious when we come back to, a peacetime or
Yep.
sort of pre-war sort of interwar thinking and stuff like that. Yeah.
Quite right. And sorry, can I just finish, because I didn't probably make the point I was trying to make at the very start, because
Yep.
it's only a matter of interest. This is the case where MacArthur said go forward and sort it out, or don't come back alive, if anybody can remember. We're conscious of that.
That's like a couple of examples in wartime in historical examples. We're looking back to World War II. It seems like a regular thing on the podcast is to go back to the last time we were in a war. To look for examples of where this has occurred. What sort of other things, wartime and not wartime? That's the difficult one, right? What sort of things would inevitably lead to a commander or senior commander or senior leader being held to account?
That's hard to work out. And when we were at the table, we tried to, which is typical, I suppose, to make it clear so definitely and you can recognise it, and here's examples and so on.
Force certainty onto uncertainty.
Yeah, exactly. Almost like a matrix or something. But that was hard because it utterly depends, and it's somewhat why the trust and confidence idea is useful, because you can see it. So what might be tolerable in one context could be intolerable in another because of the factors affecting it. But I'll give you a sense of it. I think consequence matters. So the scale of the consequence, what does it mean? And consequence will be the thing, whether it's a loss of a large number of lives or even a single life, if the circumstances are such that, I'm talking in peacetime now, that the accident that happened was so reckless in its form. But I think it has to be something quite serious. But again, it's measured by the loss of trust and confidence. I think that kind of thing. I think a careless or reckless public comment that has an effect on trust and confidence, and not just in you or the institution, but if a general officer makes a comment that might cause a loss of trust and confidence in the government, that would be utterly inappropriate, and that probably is a circumstance if it's significant enough. I think in wartime it's a bit more clear cut. I think that example from the case study of Bastion is a clear one. I think that would be, you would hope that somebody would stand aside in that circumstance. I think in battle, that if you're losing battles, and we know that there's a correlation between losing and morale, and that rebuilding confidence is hard in battle, so changing commanders matters. Then there's ample case studies, and we just went through them. I think Ridgway's restoration of the 8th Army in Korea is another good case study of this. I think another one, and this is a hard one, and I wanted to touch on this, and I'm probably going to explain it badly, but I think we need to, and we're looking at this, find a way to hold our generals, or me, to account when on peacetime performance. And I'm not talking about the performance on an exercise or something, but if for over a long period of time in peace that the generalship allows the skills and standards of the army to erode to a point that if we were to go to war tomorrow with a reasonable amount of time to get ready in that last moment, but you don't often get that. If you've allowed it to erode, or the psyche of the army, its morale, it's a spree, its sense of what it takes to fight, whether if you've allowed its mental conditioning to erode such that it's fragile and folds in the first contact, I think we need to find a way to hold ourselves to account for that, and because that sort of takes away almost personal failures, personal bad behaviour, the easy, obvious ones. If something terribly goes wrong in an accident, that's sort of an obvious one. But I think the more meaningful one is to the extent that the generals allow the army to degrade such that it's not fulfilling its service to the nation, which is its capacity to go and win wars on behalf of the nation, that its capacity to win battles. I think that's probably the more serious one. How you work that out, I don't know, and we probably need to do some hard thinking.
Because that's the hard thing, how to measure it, but also, I mean, in your example, if you get sent to do something and you collapse at the first shot, that's obvious, right?
Yeah.
Very obvious example.
Yeah.
But who measures it and who determines that we're not ready? That they're the difficult task, I suppose, that it is
difficult.
With. Yeah.
But the markers are always there. Of course, the great case study of this is Task Force Smith, the American Task Force Smith. It's funny that maybe it's me because maybe I've spent too much time there. But to their credit, the Americans are far happier looking at and acknowledging their military failures than what we are. Dare anybody sort of look back on Australian military history and suggest that we had quite serious failures and so on, of which we have many. Yeah. But Task Force Smith is a classic example because it was introduced into a war, and really it's only 5 years after the end of the Second World War. But the US Army had allowed a whole number of things happen to it that led to sending in a force that was utterly unprepared in all sorts of ways that we spoke about. I mean, and the point I want to make there is not the actions of Task Force Smith per se, but the markers of its inevitable poor performance were all there in the lead up, and people were even discussing it in that sort of period between the two wars. So I think if we were honest with ourselves, we'd do that. And look, we are doing this. We've invested in the last 12 months, and look, I'm getting slightly off subject, but it's useful, a lot of effort in trying to work out in our system that we're giving enough resources, that we've got the right things culturally, doctrinally, to make us ready for war, but also to be able to recognise in ourselves those things that we might be doing badly or doing wrong, or where senior leadership is being negligent, that should be raising alarm bells that, hey, this is not the path we should be on. So we're trying to work on that now, but you can imagine that's much easier said than done.
You talked about so a number of different examples, Task Force Smith being the most recent one. If we go back to a thing you said before about predecessors, sort of you coming into an appointment, I'm not going to use the word command, but an appointment as a senior leader or general, and something happening in the command or appointment before yours. You talked about the erosion of trust and confidence and someone measuring that and it being quite obvious in certain circumstances. Should you, I suppose it's a leading question, but should you step down or step aside, noting that you had no control over that and it's from circumstances of a predecessor before you were appointed? Yeah.
So we did discuss this. And I think the answer's in the idea of restoration of trust and confidence. Now, it can't be... This is a difficult one because it can't just be virtue signalling, because that won't have any consequence. But to some extent, in this case, the virtue signalling might be the thing that sort of takes away the tension in something or restores a sense of trust and confidence, not necessarily in the individual, but in the officer corps, the general officer group, the senior leaders, by somebody stepping aside. So we did discuss this, and we walked out with a view that that if the matter is of such seriousness that it's got such a serious loss of trust and confidence, whether it's with the public, the government, or with our own troops, or all of them, and it is a function of the actions or the inactions of the predecessor or the group of leaders of the past, and it might be immediate past or a bit further back, that to restore trust and confidence now, the individual most appropriate, probably the chief, ought to step aside. Now that's I don't want to get ahead of where we will fall down, but I can tell you we did discuss it. Our thinking at the moment is that you should. Otherwise if this is about the institution itself and trust and confidence, and you know that you could restore it by that action, well then it seems obvious then that you should, because ultimately it's not about you, it's about those things.
So we talked about predecessors, the broader context, and it seems like there's a huge shift between being directly accountable and then sort of lifting to a point where it's about the organisation and not you and and trust and confidence. It's going to get senior officers their backs up, and it risk averse, right? So it could, I suppose senior leaders, as they listen to this, will sort of think like, is he coming for me, or is the organisation coming for me? What do you say on that risk aversion component, with senior leaders now, noting that we're taking a more deliberate stand on sort of holding senior leadership to account?
Potentially it does. And of course, it's something that depends on the individual and their predisposition to these things. We did discuss this idea that, look, what we're talking about here to some extent is old-fashioned honour. What is the honourable thing to do? That to some extent that idea might help mitigate the risk, that the act itself can be seen in a positive light for what it's doing. You're acting in the interests that this is a necessary sacrifice. And what I'm not trying to do here, because it could sound like I'm trying to take away responsibility when in fact, in some cases, somebody could be very much directly should have done something or could have done something. But that sense of honour and we recognise too that it's not something you can just create overnight, that we need to imbue this into the whole officer corps, that from your foundations, this sense of, hey, it ain't about you, it's about others. Command is a difficult thing but a privilege. In the lower levels it comes with strict liability, but for generals it has this institutional sense, and that through the officer training continuum at the right stages we need to introduce these ideas. But if you imbue an officer corps with that sense of what is right and it becomes embedded in it, then I suspect that addresses that sense of risk. I reckon though it'll take us some time to address. Like I said earlier, if we did this immediately tomorrow to somebody and it was imposed on them, it would still be seen, because we've all been involved in the discussion, the individual might recognise, well, this is probably what I ought to do for the sake of the institution. I suspect because we've never really done it, this would be seen to be utterly personal, an utter personal failure, even if the individual couldn't have done anything or was in no position to, or was a consequence of a predecessor, whatever it is. Even if it was perfectly obvious, it would seem to be personal. I think we need to do some work to set up what this is. And forgive me because I don't say that as a cop-out, because I think we've explored this sufficiently now that if the circumstance came up and there was sufficient loss of trust and confidence, that we would be seeking to manifest everything that I've sort of just described amongst the Army's generals.
When we talk about we talked a lot about the decision point where we know that trust and confidence has been eroded to the point where we must stand aside or resign or be told to resign. What sort of work, and you've gone through that component, what does it look like when those conditions are set to trigger a resignation or something? Have we done work on the subsequent part where it's like we know how difficult it is to reinforce that it's an honourable thing, and so that first round down the barrel is going to be difficult because it's like, now we need to sort of restore that honour or say that it was for these reasons and it's a good thing. Have we done any work in that sense? And then I suppose redemption when we come back to that.
We're not entirely clear, but I think this, how it takes place is what you're getting at. We did discuss that it probably requires statements, public statements, depending on the kind of thing it was. If it's a public event, a public knowledge, it needs a public statement. If it's something where the loss of trust and confidence is internal to the Army and you're not the service chief, then there's probably an explanation to the Army. But I think the explanation is important, that the individual is taking responsibility and then standing up before it and then explaining the circumstances, saying, for the sake of restoring trust and confidence, I'm standing aside. And look, it might be that that you're standing aside for a period of time, and then maybe if it's a function of something terrible that's happened, a training accident or something, and as the matter is dealt with and these things normally happen over a long period of time, that you're found to be utterly exonerated, that nothing you could or should have done, that potentially then there's a restoration and so on. But I think the truth is, because those kinds of things take so long, and that particularly with a small army like ours, that there won't be the opportunity. There's a certain extent. I think where somebody might be removed from command at lower levels because of that sense of strict liability for something, there is, of course, there must be some form of redemption, and otherwise we'll end up with zero defect risk culture. But I'll put that aside. I think the truth is, for senior officers, unless you're sort of the size of the US Army in the Second World War, and it's going for long enough that you can be restored to another command position and there's some redemption. The truth is, outside of that, there probably is no path to redemption. That your standing aside is it. I think maybe I'm overstating that a little bit, but going back to it, there needs to be some. For it to work, some public statement. And I think most importantly, if there is no public statement and something has seriously gone wrong where the general officer could well have been reckless or negligent or incompetent, and that they're stood aside and go on a long leave or retired, then that's a serious risk, because it would look like, and probably quite rightly, that they've been looked after. Oh, look, they've just been pushed aside. They're not going to have to answer for their actions, and it would be seen that way. So some public reckoning is necessary, I think, for this to work.
There's a couple of times you talked about standing aside and relieving command, I suppose, and doing that sort of side of the house. The US has a good history of resigning or offering resignation. I suppose, what are the difference between, because they seem synonymous, but there are distinct factors between both. What is the difference between sort of stepping aside from command and remaining in the organisation versus resigning or offering your resignation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't have a good answer for it. In fact, it's something we didn't really go after, but we did to a bit, and I'll just give you a sense of it. Again, I suspect that the circumstance would dictate what is the most appropriate option, whether it's you're relieved, you're going on a period of sort of directed leave while the matter's looked into, or you resign. And remember, the whole point of this is that it happens quickly. You're restoring trust quickly. It's not waiting for a fact-finding or an investigation. You recognise in the moment it's appropriate for me to take one of those actions. I think resignation is more difficult potentially because in one sense you take away any possibility of redemption if indeed that's appropriate in the event, but probably more so it might be seen to be a way of walking away and getting away with when in fact it might be found that your actions or inaction is so reckless or irresponsible that the more serious sanction is deserving. By resignation, you might be able to get away with that. So that sort of relief or directed leave and standing aside that allows for a fullness of inquiry that can allow for you to be held to account fully in the fullness of time might be the difference. But that's that's probably one that we probably need to spend some more time on. But that's my intuitive sense of the difference between the two. Mm-hmm.
We've covered command responsibility, why it's a problem. I asked you for a definition at the lead of the episode. That was the wrong question. It's like, why is it a problem, or how have we identified that it's so important that we fix this or sort of make headway in this circumstance? We talked about what work has been done and what case studies you sort of looked at in terms of trying to define it. Noting I said you had 7 case studies to go through and you got to 2 in great detail. The decision point at which it seems like the obvious time to restore trust and confidence and honour, and that being an honourable act to do that, to step aside, difference between resignation and stepping aside or relieving command. Have you got any other points, I suppose, on command responsibility, or we sort of worked out an incredibly complex topic with indirect sort of feeds into making decisions and who makes it and how we quantify it and stuff? Is there anything else you'd like to touch on, sir, before we?
No, I don't think so, mate. I think that covers it. Yeah, and hopefully those listening get a sense that it's an important topic. I imagine that there will be some scepticism as to whether, when the moment comes, are we really going to see anybody do anything? And that's a valid concern. to some extent, in addressing this, I think what we're trying to do is restore what has been a loss of trust for a number of reasons over the recent decade or so between generals and rank and file, to be frank. So I think, and the proof will be in the pudding. But no, I think we've probably covered the full scope of it. And like I was trying to say there, everybody gets a sense that it's not an easy topic, but we are taking it quite seriously.
Yeah, and identifying that I suppose there are murmurs and sort of it is at the forefront of a lot of people's minds. Like you talked at the start of the episode in Brereton and the like. Thank you so much for your time, Sir Major General Chris Smith. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Todd.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Cove Podcast. Explore our channel for more great audio PME content. Also, visit us at cove.army.gov.au for hundreds of additional resources. The Cove, the learning home of the Australian profession of arms.